Hello, and welcome to this talk, Culturally Justified Hate, Prevalence and Mental Health Impact of Dark Participation in Games. This is a recording of a presentation I gave at the HICSS conference in January 2024, but as part of my mission here on Zeitgeist is to present the work that I do, the empirical work, the academic work, the scientific work, and make it accessible to people who couldn't be in the room. Because Hawaii is a far away destination if you live anywhere close to me. And so I understand why not be there. So this work, I should also mention, is available. I will link it in the notes as a fully open access written up article. So if you want to learn more about the methods and the results and the literature that led up to doing this study, you can do all that, and it is freely available. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me, I am Dr. Rachel Coward. I'm sorry the subtitles aren't available right now. I'm speaking into my microphone. I don't really know. Sorry, I apologize. YouTube should make subtitles. I'm the research director of Take This. Take This is a mental health nonprofit. We work with the gaming industry and gaming communities to destigmatize mental health challenges and provide mental health information and support. This project today, you may have noticed other names on the title screen, Dr. Elizabeth Kilmer and Alex Newhouse, because we are all working on this joint project that is made possible from the Department of Security, generally looking at radicalization networks in gaming spaces. This is just one part of that. So hate, harassment, and other forms of toxicity have come to be nearly synonymous with video game communities. Prevalence is quite high. This is work from the Anti-Defamation League from 2021, where they say 5 out of 6 adults experience harassment in games. 3 out of 5 young people, so under 18, report the same. And nearly 3 out of 4 adults say they experience severe abuse, physical threats, and sustained harassment. It's also worth noting that every year the ADL has done this report, the proportion of people who report that they have experienced hate and harassment in games has gone up. So in 2022, 77% said they had experienced it at some point, which was up from 65% in 2019. In my own work, I've looked at prevalence data. This is actually something that was presented at HICSS in 2021 with my colleague, Chrissy Cook. We can see here that various forms of toxicity, we're calling it dark participation here, is very common. The rates that have been directly experienced by players are reported in orange, or directly experienced are in blue, and witnessed are in orange. And we can see all kinds of incidences from trash talking to cheating to verbal spamming, all quite commonplace. And if we look at more extreme forms of dark participation, sexual harassment, hate speech, and violent threats, again, directly experienced in blue, witnessed in orange. We also see that this is quite common, quite normalized, more the norm than the exception. Now, you may also notice in these 2 examples I gave of the ADL data and my own data, me and Dr. Cook's data, that different words are being used. Some people say harassment, some people specifically say sexual harassment. Some say hate speech, other people measure hate speech as a separate thing from violent threats. And this is where we start to come into the motivation for this presentation today, is that there's a lot of differences in the research in this space, one of which is a difference in just language. And these differences and inconsistencies have made it difficult to kind of create a cohesive knowledge base for all of us in this space to build upon. And that is what the paper here has focused on, the foundational challenges to understanding dark participation in games and measuring dark participation in games. So in this paper, we outline what we believe are the 6 challenges: creating a shared language, measuring where these events are happening, is it in gaming spaces or adjacent spaces, measuring the mental health impacts of these activities, looking at these experiences across gender, looking at how players are attempting to mitigate these efforts, what are the player-led efforts in this space, and then also the cultural normalization of hate and harassment in gaming spaces. What does that look like? Is it normalized? Do people see it as part of the culture? Now, for HICSS, they only gave me 10 minutes to talk, so you will find this to be quite a brief presentation, and I can't go through every measure used, but that's what it's for. But this is kind of the TLDR generally of how we assess all of these challenges. We did a survey. We looked at just over 400 people, half were male, good age range. Most were from the US, some from the UK. It was a limitation of the IRB that it had to be limited to US and UK participants only. So we keep that in mind when we think about the interpretations, that this is coming from a North American perspective. So we asked people, have you ever experienced dark participation? This is kind of reinforcing the prevalence data. And here we see most, 82% say they have been a victim of dark participation, 88% have witnessed it. And the most common forms that were witnessed and experienced were trash talking, verbal spamming, griefing, sexual harassment, hate speech, and cheating. I found it interesting that hate speech and sexual harassment were witnessed more frequently than they were reported as being a direct target of. And I think that this is reflective of the idea that the targets of these actions are more likely to be members of marginalized identities, but anyone in the space can witness it. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing in the findings. If we look at the most severe harms, sexual harassment again included here, hate speech, threats of violence, incitement of violence, hate rating, doxing, and swatting. The prevalence is still quite high. I mean, I was actually kind of surprised how common doxing has been witnessed. 1 in 5 people say they've witnessed it happen to somebody they know. Of course, this is less common than the less severe forms, which is good. We do want to see that, but I would argue that this is still far too high of an incidence rate that we're seeing in gaming spaces of these more extreme and severe forms of negative action. In terms of location, most people say they've witnessed and directly experienced within games themselves. They report equally witnessing and targeting in-game and game adjacent spaces. Specifically, women were more likely to be a target and a witness of non-game related activity, which I thought was interesting, namely harassment, whereas males were more likely to be a target of things like in-game cheating. The mental health impact, the most common response was feeling angry or uncomfortable. We also see feeling less social, increased anxiety, and PTSD symptomology. It's worth noting that post-traumatic stress disorder symptomology for those who had directly experienced dark participation was nearly 60%. And I feel like PTSD gets thrown out in a very casual way, but this is not a casual repercussion. This is significant and severe. Even for witnesses, 20% say they have this symptomology. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric disorder. It's a reaction from either being directly experiencing or a witness to a traumatic event. Symptoms include intrusive thoughts, psychological distress, depressed mood, sleep disturbance, problems with concentration, feeling of detachment or estrangement, persistent negative emotional states. These are significant challenges that impact people's ability to exist in all areas of their life. So when we talk about the mental health impact of toxicity, I don't want it to be this flippant thing. You're like, oh, people felt uncomfortable. Yeah, for some people, a significant proportion, 60% of direct targets and 20% of witnesses, it is causing significant challenges in all areas of their life and impeding their ability to function, to thrive, to work, to play. It's an important point. Women, in terms of gender differences, women were more likely to experience mental health impacts across the board. Men were more likely to report no mental health impact at all. But again, I think this is more related to the fact they're more likely to be targets and witnesses of in-game cheating and that sort of thing versus the more severe outcomes like sexual harassment. Player mitigation strategies. I thought this was really interesting in terms of looking at what people do behaviorally when they're reacting to these actions in the gaming space. Most common was to block or report. Women were more likely to engage in whisper networks. This is the last bit here, which I thought was really interesting. That's long been a method of survival for women. So that tracks. And for those who were direct targets, the relationship between the likelihood to ignore the comment when gender was significant, men were more likely to comment women, and women were more likely to comment support. Again, probably related to the kind of dark participation they are experiencing. And the part that was most interesting to me, because I tend to live in the world of gamer cultures, and that's where my research interests lie strongly. We asked if toxic behavior was an acceptable social norm. Is it acceptable? Is it culturally justifiable? Is this something that you just have to say, hey, this is part of this place? And 80% said yes. Now, we purposefully said toxic and left it vague for people to interpret, but we did ask a follow-up question about hateful behavior. So if toxic behavior is acceptable, what about hateful behavior, which I think we could all objectively say hateful behavior is wrong and negative and shouldn't happen anywhere. But for 70% of people, they said, yeah, that's also just a social norm. It is a culturally justifiable thing that happens in games. That's quite upsetting, that the cultures have come to a place of apathy or acceptance, that hate and harassment just happens here. And that's part of what you will experience if you're playing games. So to wrap up, I did go over my 10 minutes here, but there's no moderator. Dark participation is prevalent. More than 1 in 3 people have been direct targets of severe forms of harassment, hate speech, sexual harassment, and violence. Women are more likely to be direct targets of severe harassment. It's more likely to happen in-game than in game adjacent, which is really important when we start talking about transparency efforts and moderation efforts, where our energy needs to be focused. Mental health impact is severe and broad. 90% of people are impacted from being a direct target or being a witness of some form of participation. Most common to report, block, or ignore. And I really hate having this line here, but you know, hate is normal. It is seen as culturally justified. And this is a problem on a moral level, but also when extreme thoughts and ideas are normalized, it can reduce an individual's resilience. It creates a vulnerability about internalizing these actions, but also when hate is normalized in one space, it normalizes in all spaces. And so we really need to be taking it seriously that people are seeing hate and toxicity as a normal part of this culture. Where do we go? I mean, I think of all these takeaways, number one, for me, is most important in creating a shared language. It doesn't have to be my language. It doesn't have to be my categories. It just has to be someone's categories, and we all just need to move forward with that. I also think that in terms of moving forward and shifting and changing this normalization, it's a complex problem. I think that the industry has to be involved in these conversations of how we can move into developing more resilient communities that prevent these actions from taking hold in the first place. Our digital playgrounds are important environments for growth and learning, and it's imperative that we can do that in a way in which we are safe and future research. Obviously, more globalized community would be great. I would like to look at the role of competition. MOBAs have a reputation being spaces that are particularly worse than other spaces. So I think we need to look at kind of how competition may inflate or conflate with these outcomes. And also in-game audio, I mean, we only looked at text-based hate and harassment. We know that audio is, if not the predominant form, I mean, I would argue perhaps the predominant form of communication in gaming spaces, certainly for competitive games. So it is also important to look into what is happening there, prevalence, repercussions, mitigation strategies, etc. That is all. This is how you can reach me. There's a lovely QR code to find other places to reach me. I do hope you enjoyed this presentation, and if you have any questions, they are probably answered in the paper that is linked below. Until next time, be excellent to each other and always cite resources.